Victoria Hayes had everything a woman could want in Austin, Texas. A husband who smiled at her every morning, a craftsman-style home in Travis Heights with bougainvillea climbing the fence, and a best friend who knew every secret she'd ever whispered. From the outside, her life looked like a postcard, bright, warm, and perfectly composed. But beneath that glossy surface, something rotten had been growing for years, spreading roots so deep that when it finally broke through, it would shatter everything she believed about love, loyalty, and herself. This is a story about betrayal. But more than that, it's a story about what happens after betrayal. When the person you thought you were disappears, and you're left standing in the wreckage wondering if you'll ever feel whole again. Victoria's journey didn't start with strength. It started with humiliation. It started with the kind of pain that makes you want to disappear. But somewhere along that dark road, she found something most people never do. The quiet, unshakable power that comes from rebuilding yourself brick by brick, with no one watching and no one cheering. By the end, she would learn that revenge isn't loud or cruel. Sometimes it's simply living well. So well that the people who destroyed you can only stand outside and watch through the glass. What you're about to hear is the story of a woman who lost everything and became everything. It's about the lies we tell ourselves, the people we trust too easily, and the moment when you realize that your worst chapter was actually the opening line of your greatest one. Victoria Hayes thought her life was over when the truth came out. She had no idea it was just beginning, and neither did the two people who broke her. Victoria had always prided herself on noticing the small things, the way her husband Marcus lingered too long on his phone during dinner, the way her best friend Sophie stopped meeting her eyes when they talked about their weekends, the way the air in her own home had started to feel wrong, like the temperature had shifted just enough to make her skin prickle, but not enough to name why. For months, she told herself she was imagining it. For months, she smoothed over the doubt with rationalizations and forced smiles. Until the day she came home early from a work conference and found Sophie's car parked in her driveway at 2 p.m. She didn't burst through the door. She didn't scream or cry. She stood on her own front porch, key in hand, and felt her entire body go cold. This is it, she thought. This is the moment everything changes. When she finally pushed the door open, the house was too quiet. She heard muffled laughter from upstairs, her bedroom, and her legs moved on autopilot, carrying her up the stairs even as her mind begged her to turn around. The door was cracked open. She saw them before they saw her. Marcus, Sophie, tangled together in the bed she'd made that morning, laughing like teenagers. When Victoria spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. How long? They scrambled, faces flushing, pulling at sheets and clothes. But there was no panic in their eyes, no shame, just irritation, like she'd interrupted something they'd earned the right to enjoy. Marcus recovered first, sitting up with a sigh that sounded almost bored. Vic, listen. This isn't what you think. Sophie, her best friend of 12 years, the woman who'd been her maid of honor, crossed her arms and looked Victoria up and down with something close to pity. Honestly, Vic, we didn't plan this. It just happened. You've been so closed off lately. So boring. The word hit like a slap. Boring. Marcus stood, pulling on his jeans with casual ease, like this was just another inconvenient conversation. She's right. You've let yourself go. You're predictable. You don't try anymore. Sophie makes me feel alive. Victoria felt her knees buckle, but she didn't fall. She stood there, frozen, as the two people she loved most in the world dismantled her piece by piece with words she'd never forget. Boring, predictable, closed off. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make them hurt the way she was hurting. But all she could do was turn around and walk out of that room, down the stairs, and out the front door. Behind her, she heard Sophie's voice, light and almost relieved. She'll get over it. Victoria sat in her car in the driveway, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and realized she had nowhere to go. Her parents were gone. Her other friends were really their friends, Marcus's work crowd, Sophie's book club crew. She had built her entire life around two people, and they had just lit it on fire. What do I do now? She thought. Where do I even start? But the answer didn't come. Not that day. Not for a long time. What happens when the two people you trust most become the ones who destroy you? And can you ever really trust yourself again after that? The divorce was swift and merciless. Marcus's lawyer was expensive, polished, and well-prepared. Victoria's was overworked and underpaid, a public defender she could barely afford after Marcus froze their joint accounts. The house, her house, the one she'd painted and furnished and loved, went to him. The car, the savings, even the dog. In the courtroom, Marcus looked calm, almost sympathetic, like he was the victim of her unreasonable emotions. Sophie sat in the gallery, holding his hand. Victoria sat alone. The whispers started immediately. In a city like Austin, where everyone knew everyone, the story spread like wildfire. She became the woman who couldn't keep her husband, the boring wife, the one who got replaced. People she'd considered friends stopped calling. Her work colleagues grew distant, uncomfortable, as if betrayal might be contagious. Sophie and Marcus moved in together 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, posting photos of their new life on social media. Farmers market brunches, sunset hikes at Mount Bonnell, smiling selfies with captions about new beginnings and finding real love. Victoria saw every single one. She couldn't stop looking, even though each image felt like a knife twisting deeper. She couldn't afford to stay in Austin, not emotionally and certainly not financially. With what little savings she'd managed to pull from an old account Marcus didn't know about, she packed a suitcase, sold what she could, and bought a one-way bus ticket to Houston. No plan, no contacts, just the desperate, clawing need to disappear. The first night in Houston, she stayed in a motel off the highway that smelled like mildew and regret. She lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, and felt the full weight of her new reality. She was 34 years old, alone, broke, and utterly invisible. The first few months were a blur of survival. She worked 2 jobs, one as a waitress at a downtown diner, the other cleaning offices at night. She slept 4 hours if she was lucky, ate ramen and gas station sandwiches, and cried in the shower where no one could hear. Every morning, she woke up and thought about giving up. Every night, she forced herself to get up and do it all again. There was no grand revelation, no moment of sudden strength, just the grim, mechanical discipline of putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping felt like admitting they'd won. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. She started taking evening classes at a community college. Graphic design, something she'd always been interested in but never pursued. She met people who didn't know her story, who saw her as just another student trying to improve her life. She began freelancing on the side, designing logos and flyers for small businesses. The work was hard, the pay was terrible, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten. Pride. When you lose everything, do you discover who you really are, or do you become someone entirely new? The first year in Houston was brutal in ways Victoria couldn't have anticipated. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the poverty, it was the loneliness. She'd spent so much of her adult life defined by other people that without them, she barely knew who she was. She'd been Marcus's wife, Sophie's best friend, the woman who hosted dinner parties and remembered birthdays. Now she was no one, and the silence was deafening. There were nights when she sat alone in her cramped studio apartment, staring at her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But there was no one to call. She attended her design classes religiously, treating them like a lifeline. Her instructor, a woman named Yolanda Chen who'd built her own branding agency from scratch, took notice of Victoria's work. It was raw but honest, full of emotion and unexpected boldness. After class one evening, Yolanda pulled her aside. "You've got something," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "But you're holding back. I can see it in your designs. You're afraid of being too much, too bold, too loud. You need to stop apologizing for taking up space." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She realized Yolanda was right. She'd spent years making herself smaller, quieter, more palatable. It was a habit she'd learned long before Marcus and Sophie. She started saying yes to things that terrified her. Open mic nights for designers to showcase their work. Networking events where she had to introduce herself to strangers. Small freelance gigs that required her to pitch her ideas with confidence she didn't yet feel. At first, it was agony. She stumbled over her words, second-guessed every decision, felt her face burn with embarrassment. But gradually, something unexpected happened. She got better. Not perfect, not fearless, but better. And with each small success, the voice in her head that sounded like Marcus and Sophie grew a little quieter. She met people who saw her differently. A single mother named Keisha who worked the night shift with her and shared stories about rebuilding after her own divorce. a tattoo artist named Elijah who hired her to design his shop's logo and told her she had a gift for capturing emotion in images. A yoga instructor named Priya who invited her to free community classes and taught her that strength wasn't about being hard. It was about being flexible enough to bend without breaking. These people didn't know the old Victoria, the one who'd been called boring and predictable. They only knew this version, scrappy, determined, still figuring it out. By the end of that first year, Victoria had landed a part-time position at a small marketing firm. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and it meant she could quit the cleaning job. She moved into a slightly better apartment, one with actual sunlight and a kitchen that didn't make her feel claustrophobic. She bought herself a decent laptop, her first real investment in her new career. And late one night, sitting at her secondhand desk, she designed something just for herself, a logo that would eventually become the foundation of her own company. She didn't know it yet, but she was no longer rebuilding. She was building something entirely new. Can you recognize your own strength when you're still in the middle of the fight, or does it only become clear when you look back? 5 years passed. 5 years of relentless work, smart risks, and the kind of discipline that only comes from having lost everything once and refusing to let it happen again. Victoria launched her own design studio, Hayes Collective, focusing on brand identity for women-owned businesses and nonprofits. Her aesthetic was distinctive, clean, elegant, empowering. She didn't just design logos, she helped women tell their stories visually, giving them the confidence to step into their own power. Word spread quickly. Her client list grew. Her reputation became golden. But Victoria didn't stop at building a business. She started hosting free workshops for women going through divorce, teaching them basic design and marketing skills they could use to start over financially. She partnered with local shelters, offering her services pro bono to help women rebuild their lives. She wrote blog posts about resilience, self-worth, and the power of starting from zero. She never mentioned Marcus or Sophie by name, but anyone who read between the lines could see the story underneath. She'd turned her pain into purpose, and people responded. They saw themselves in her. By year 5, Hayes Collective had a small but dedicated team, a sleek office in Houston's Montrose neighborhood, and a 6-figure revenue stream. Victoria had become the woman she'd once needed. Strong, self-sufficient, generous, and unshakable. She'd cut her hair short, dressed in sharp blazers and understated jewelry, and learned to hold a room's attention without raising her voice. People who met her now would never guess she'd once been the woman crying in a motel shower, wondering if she'd survive the week. She'd become proof that survival wasn't enough. You could actually thrive. She dated occasionally, but never seriously. She'd learned to enjoy her own company, to fill her life with work she loved and people who respected her. She didn't need someone to complete her. She was whole on her own. And if she still thought about Marcus and Sophie sometimes, late at night, when the city grew quiet, it wasn't with anger anymore. It was with something closer to pity. They'd destroyed her to feel alive, and in doing so, they'd given her the greatest gift of all, freedom from needing them. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She almost deleted it, but something made her open it. The message was short, desperate, and signed with a name that made her stomach drop. Victoria, I need your help, please. Marcus. She stared at the screen for a long time, her coffee growing cold in her hand. 5 years ago, this message would have shattered her. Today, it barely rippled the surface. But she was curious. What could the man who'd destroyed her possibly need from her now? And more importantly, did she want to know?
If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get back to it.
Victoria didn't respond immediately. She sat with the message for 3 days, letting it sit in her inbox like a stone at the bottom of a pond. Part of her wanted to delete it and move on, but another part, the part that had built her entire career on helping people through their worst moments, was curious. What kind of desperation would drive Marcus to reach out after all these years? She finally typed back a single line. What do you need? His response came within minutes, long and rambling, full of self-pity and thinly veiled panic. His company had collapsed. He'd invested everything in a tech startup that went under, taking his savings and his reputation with it. His credit was destroyed. His professional network had dried up. And Sophie, the woman who'd made him feel so alive, had left him 6 months ago for someone with better prospects. Someone who could still afford the lifestyle she wanted. He was living in a rented room in South Austin, working gig jobs to make rent and drowning in debt. "I know I don't deserve your help," he wrote, "but I'm desperate. You always said I had potential. Maybe you could, I don't know, put in a word somewhere? Help me get back on my feet?" Victoria read the message twice, then set her phone down and laughed. A short, sharp sound that surprised her. The audacity. The sheer, breathtaking audacity. The man who'd humiliated her, who'd called her boring and predictable, who'd taken everything she'd built and walked away smiling, was now asking her for help. She could have ignored him, blocked his number, moved on. But instead, she typed, "Let's meet. My office. Thursday at 2 p.m. She wanted to see him. Not for closure. She'd found that years ago. But because she wanted him to see her. Thursday arrived bright and clear. Victoria dressed carefully that morning. A tailored charcoal blazer, silk blouse, her favorite heels. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who'd earned every inch of the confidence she now carried. At precisely 2 p.m., Marcus arrived at Hayes Collective. The receptionist, a sharp young woman named Daniela, called Victoria's extension. "Your 2 o'clock is here." Victoria took a breath, smoothed her blazer, and walked out to the lobby. Marcus looked small. That was the first thing she noticed. He'd aged badly. Thinning hair, rumpled clothes, shoulders hunched like he was bracing for a blow. When he saw her, his face crumpled with relief, and something that might have been shame. "Victoria. God, you look amazing." She smiled politely, professionally. "Thank you. Follow me." She led him through the open office space, her team working at clean desks, mood boards on the walls, the hum of productivity and purpose. She could feel Marcus taking it all in, his discomfort growing with every step. When they reached her private office, glass walls, minimalist furniture, a view of downtown, she gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit." He did, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Victoria let the silence stretch, watching him fidget. Then, calmly, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Tell me what you need." Marcus launched into his story again. More detailed this time. More pathetic. He needed a job, a reference, anything. He'd hit rock bottom, and he didn't know where else to turn. "I know I hurt you," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I don't deserve this, but I'm asking anyway, for old time's sake." Victoria listened without interrupting. When he finished, she folded her hands on her desk and met his eyes. "I don't hire people who destroyed me to build themselves, especially when they didn't even build anything worth keeping. Can forgiveness and refusal coexist in the same breath, or does one always demand the sacrifice of the other?" Marcus's face went pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Victoria, please, I'm sorry. I know I was terrible. I was selfish and cruel and—" She raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You were all of those things," she said, her voice calm and even. "But that's not why I won't help you. I won't help you because you haven't changed. You didn't come here because you wanted to apologize or make amends. You came here because you need something. Again. And you thought I'd be soft enough to give it to you." He slumped in his chair, the last bit of hope draining from his face. "So that's it? You're just going to let me suffer?" Victoria tilted her head, considering him. "You know what's funny, Marcus? 5 years ago, I would have begged you to stay. I would have blamed myself for your betrayal. I would have done anything to make you love me again. But you taught me something valuable. I don't need people who don't see my worth, and I certainly don't owe them anything just because they're finally desperate enough to notice what they lost." She stood, smoothing her blazer, signaling the end of the meeting. "I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do. But it won't be here." Marcus rose slowly, his hands shaking. "You've changed," he said quietly, and she couldn't tell if it was an accusation or an observation. She smiled. A real smile this time, warm and genuine. "Yes, I have. That's what happens when you stop defining yourself by people who never deserved you." She walked him to the door, and he paused, looking back one last time. "Does it make you feel good, seeing me like this?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't make me feel anything, and that's how I know I've moved on." She watched him walk out of her office, across the lobby, and out the front door. Daniela looked up from her desk, eyebrows raised in a silent question. Victoria just shook her head and smiled. "Close the door, please. I have work to do." That evening, Victoria sat at her desk after everyone had gone home, the city lights glittering below. She thought about Marcus, not with anger or satisfaction, but with a strange, quiet peace. She'd imagined a moment like this for years in the early days, fantasized about him begging, about her having the power to refuse. But now that it had happened, it felt anticlimactic, because the truth was her victory had never been about him. It had been about her, about proving to herself that she could build something beautiful from the ashes of her worst chapter. She opened her laptop and pulled up a document she'd been working on, a proposal for a new initiative at Hayes Collective, a mentorship program for women recovering from betrayal. She typed a single line at the top. "This is for the women who think they won't survive. You will. And you'll be stronger than you ever imagined." Is the greatest revenge living well, or is it reaching back to help others climb out of the same darkness that once swallowed you? Victoria poured herself into the mentorship program with a fervor that surprised even her. She partnered with women's shelters, community centers, and divorce support groups across Houston. She brought in guest speakers, therapists, financial planners, entrepreneurs, who could offer practical guidance alongside emotional support. She taught workshops on branding, on building a portfolio from scratch, on pricing your work and negotiating your worth. But more than that, she taught resilience. She told her story, the whole ugly truth of it, and watched as women in the audience wiped away tears and nodded in recognition. The program grew faster than she'd anticipated. Within 6 months, she'd helped over 50 women start their own small businesses or side hustles. Some were designing websites, others selling handmade goods. A few had launched consulting practices. They weren't all success stories. Some struggled, some gave up. But enough of them thrived that Victoria knew she was onto something. She started getting calls from local media, from podcasts and blogs that wanted to feature her work. She said yes to all of it, not because she craved attention, but because she wanted other women to know it was possible. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a workshop, her assistant knocked on her office door. "Victoria, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's personal." Victoria frowned. "Who is it?" The assistant hesitated. "She said her name is Sophie." Victoria's heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She simply nodded and said, "Give me 5 minutes, then send her in." When Sophie walked through the door, Victoria almost didn't recognize her. The polished, confident woman who'd stolen her husband was gone, replaced by someone who looked worn down by life. Her hair was dull, her clothes cheap and ill-fitting, her face lined with exhaustion. She stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Sophie's voice broke the silence, small and uncertain. "Hi, Vic." Victoria gestured to the chair Marcus had sat in weeks earlier. "Sit down, Sophie." Sophie did, her movements stiff and awkward. "I saw your article, in that women's magazine, about starting over after betrayal." Victoria nodded, waiting. Sophie swallowed hard. "I didn't know if you'd see me. I wouldn't blame you if you told me to leave." Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying the woman who'd once been her closest friend. "Why are you here?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Because I need help. Because I've lost everything, and because I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. Does an apology matter when it only comes after the person has nothing left to lose?" Victoria let the apology hang in the air, untouched. She didn't rush to accept it or reject it. She simply looked at Sophie, really looked at her, and tried to find any remnant of the woman she'd once loved like a sister. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so raw and childlike it almost broke through Victoria's composure. "Marcus left me," Sophie said quietly. "About a year ago. Turns out when things got hard, he wasn't interested anymore. I thought we were soulmates, you know? That what we had was real. But I was just convenient." Victoria felt a flicker of something then, not satisfaction, but a grim recognition. "So you came to me because you have nowhere else to go." Sophie's face crumpled. "I came to you because I finally understand what I did. I destroyed the best friendship I ever had for a man who didn't even really want me. I was cruel to you. I called you boring and predictable, but the truth is, I was jealous. You had integrity. You had loyalty. And I had nothing but my looks and my ability to take what wasn't mine. It was the first real thing Sophie had said, and Victoria felt the defensive walls she'd built start to crack. Just a little. What do you want from me, Sophie? Sophie looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I don't know. Forgiveness? Guidance? Maybe just proof that it's possible to come back from being the villain in someone else's story. Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. She thought about Marcus, sitting in that same chair, asking for help he hadn't earned. She thought about all the women she'd mentored, many of whom had been the other woman at some point, carrying their own shame and regret. She turned back to Sophie. I'm not going to lie to you and say this is easy. I'm not going to pretend I've completely forgiven you because I haven't. Some things leave scars, and you left deep ones. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. But, Victoria continued, I'm also not the same person I was 5 years ago. That woman needed you to suffer so she could feel vindicated. This version of me? She knows that your suffering doesn't heal me. Only my growth does. Victoria walked to her desk and pulled out a folder. Inside was information about her mentorship program, resources for women rebuilding their lives, contacts for free counseling, and job placement services. She handed it to Sophie. I can't give you what Marcus asked for, a job, a handout, an easy fix. But I can give you the same thing I give everyone who comes through that program, a chance. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just a chance to do better. Sophie took the folder with trembling hands. Why would you do this for me? Victoria's smile was small but genuine. Because someone did it for me when I had nothing. And because the best revenge isn't making you suffer. It's refusing to let what you did define who I become. Sophie left that day with the folder and a faint glimmer of hope. Victoria didn't know if she'd follow through, if she'd do the work, if she'd ever truly change. But she'd given her the tools, and that was enough. As Victoria sat back down at her desk, she felt something she hadn't expected. Lightness. For years, she'd carried the weight of what Marcus and Sophie had done to her. But in choosing to help Sophie, not because Sophie deserved it, but because Victoria was strong enough to, she'd finally set it down. The question wasn't whether Sophie would succeed. It was whether Victoria could live with the grace she'd shown, knowing that grace and boundaries could coexist. Can you help the person who hurt you most without losing yourself in the process? Or is that the ultimate test of who you've become? Victoria's story didn't end with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful reconciliation. It ended with something quieter and infinitely more powerful: peace. She continued to build Hayes Collective, expanding into new cities and helping hundreds of women transform their pain into purpose. She became a sought-after speaker, a published author, and a quiet force in her industry. But more than any of that, she became a woman who knew her worth. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd fought for it, inch by painful inch. A year after Sophie's visit, Victoria received an email. Sophie had completed the mentorship program, started a small business helping women navigate difficult divorces, and was slowly rebuilding her life. She thanked Victoria, not for forgiveness, but for showing her that change was possible. Victoria read the email twice, then filed it away. She didn't need to respond. The gesture itself was enough. As for Marcus, she never heard from him again. She didn't look for him on social media or ask mutual acquaintances what had become of him. He had exited her story and she'd allowed it. Because the truth she'd learned, carved into her bones through 5 years of relentless work, was this: the people who hurt you don't get to define your ending. You do. One evening, as Victoria prepared to give a keynote speech about resilience and second chances, there was a knock at her office door. She looked up, surprised. Her assistant had already gone home. She opened the door to find Sophie standing there, no longer the broken woman from a year ago, but someone who looked whole. Victoria smiled gently, genuinely. You're right on time, she said. I was just about to talk about what it really means to start over. This is the truth Victoria had learned and wanted every woman to know. You are not the worst thing that happened to you. You are not the betrayal, the loss, the humiliation, or the rock bottom. You are what you build from the wreckage. You are the courage it takes to try again. And sometimes the greatest act of strength isn't revenge or even forgiveness. It's simply choosing to become so whole, so powerful, so utterly yourself that the people who broke you become irrelevant to your story. What will you build from the ashes of your worst chapter? And when you finally rise, who will you choose to be?
Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you or made you think about life in a different way, don't keep it just for yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this too. And if you truly want to support this channel, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading what you have to say. And finally, if you really enjoyed it and want to help keep these stories alive, consider buying me a simple coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest gesture makes a big difference and helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thank you, and see you in the next one.